Hello and welcome back to another week of Whether or Not podcast. I'm your host, meteorologist Scott Sumner. It seems common that when March arrives and daylight saving time is brought up, most folks are welcoming to the idea. Having an extra hour of daylight at the end of the day is a promising thought after the chilly, shorter days of winter. But where did the idea of shifting time actually come from? Well, in order to understand the premise of daylight saving time, we must look back before we can look ahead. Okay, daylight saving time has been used in the U.S. and in many European countries since World War I because at that time there was an effort to conserve fuel needed to produce electric power. Now, Germany, which you see here, and Austria, which you see there, were the first countries to use daylight saving time in 1916 with the rationale that by turning the clocks back an hour, it would minimize the use of artificial lighting to save fuel for the war effort. So who started this crazy idea of manipulating clocks anyway? Well, on an island country in the South Pacific, you can thank a New Zealand entomologist, which you see right there, George Vernon Hudson, with coming up with the idea because he valued his extra hours of daylight during his leisure time when he was collecting insects. Now, during that time, there was general interest towards the shifting time. However, nothing was ever done to implement the idea. 10 years later, in 1905, independently from Hudson, British builder William Willett suggested setting the clocks ahead 20 minutes on each of the 4 Sundays in April and switching them back by the same amount of time each of the 4 Sundays in September, a total of 8 time switches per year. Now, unlike George Hudson, however, Willett's daylight savings plan caught the attention of a British member of Parliament, and he introduced the bill to the House of Commons. The first daylight savings bill was drafted in 1909, presented to Parliament, as you see here, several times, and examined by a select committee, but many, especially farmers, opposed to the idea, so the bill was really never made into law. Fast forward several years after Willett's death and during attempts to make the idea law, the world entered into World War I, and by the end of the war, the United States enacted daylight saving time in 1918. It only lasted a few months, and the bill was repealed. When the world entered World War II, well, President Franklin Roosevelt, you see here in this graphic, was in the White House, and he reestablished the idea of daylight saving time, calling it wartime. Wartime began in February of 1942 and lasted to the end of September of 1945. Again, to conserve fuel like it did in World War I, when Congress imposed one standard time on the United States to enable the country to better utilize resources. Now, during the time from 1945 to 1966, there was no federal law regarding daylight saving time, so states and localities were, free to just choose whether or not to observe daylight saving time and could choose when it began and when it ended, really. This understandably caused confusion on all levels. So in 1966, Congress stepped in and established the Uniform Time Act to regulate a yearly time change. Daylight saving time would begin the last Sunday in April and would end in the last Sunday in October. So a uniform system within each time zone was implemented, exempting only those states which voted to stay on standard time. 20 years later, under legislation enacted in 1986, daylight saving time in the U.S. began at 2 a.m. on the first Sunday of April and ended at 2 a.m. on the last Sunday of October. With all the positive and negative feelings towards whether daylight savings time should continue, evidence does not conclusively point to energy conservation as a result of daylight saving. Dating back to Willett, daylight saving advocates had touted energy conservation as an economic benefit. But a U.S. Department of Transportation study back in the 1970s concluded that total electricity savings associated with daylight saving time amounted to about a meager 1% in the spring and fall months. As air conditioning became more widespread, however, more recent studies have found that cost savings on lighting are more than offset by greater cooling expenses. As a matter of fact, the University of California, Santa Barbara economist calculated that Indiana's move to statewide daylight saving time in 2006 led to a 1% rise in residential electricity use through additional demand for air conditioning on summer evenings and heating in early spring and late fall mornings. Some also will argue that increased recreational activity during daylight saving results in greater gasoline consumption. Now, recently there has been a push to make daylight saving time year-round, as several states have passed legislation to make this law. I guess only time will tell if we see year-round daylight saving time in the future. In the meantime, God bless, be well, and we'll see you next week.